Trouble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 2, The Indian. It took his grandma a long time to fall asleep in her chair. She sat there, working a buckskin, making it soft and pliable with her hands. Twice the skin dropped to her lap, but when Dewey stirred on the floor, she straightened abruptly and said, What was that?" "It was just me, Grandma." "Well, how come you don't go lie on the bed? You can't get no sleep down there on the floor." She rose from her chair as she spoke and moved to the window. The cabin was well built. The cracks chinked tight against the wind. There was a real glass in one of the windows, and Grandma now hung a cloth over it. "There," she said. "I'll stay up with you a while," Dewey said, and with a faint nod, grateful for his company, she went back to her chair. She sat, and her head was again bent forward over the buckskin. Dewey waited. A screech owl cried out behind the cabin. Dewey glanced quickly at his grandma, knowing she would say somebody was going to die. That's what she always said when she heard a screech owl. "Grandma?" he said quietly. There was no answer. She was asleep at last. He rose and moved in absolute silence to the door, but once the dog shook himself and his ears flapped noisily against his head, Dewey winced. He drew his shoulders up and waited for his grandma to awaken and snap, "What you up to, boy?" But she did not stir. Still, without a sound, he lifted the bar and opened the door. The dog was outside first. The boy followed, pulling the door shut behind him. He breathed deeply of the cool air. Usually he loved the prairie at night. It seemed to him that this was the way the ocean would look far out to sea. He glanced out over the dark waves of grass that were almost moving in the moonlight, but tonight there was no pleasure in the sight. He was uneasy. His grandma had done it, he told himself angrily, talking about her feeling. Now he was filled with dread, too. He thought of going back into the cabin. He even lifted his hand to the door, but then he stopped, wishing suddenly he could be strong like his pa. His pa would never be frightened by an old woman's words. He would never stand here undecided, one hand raised to the door, one foot turned to the river. Dewey took a deep breath and, glancing over his shoulder, started down the path. At the bank, he paused to look down at his raft. He felt better as he looked at his handiwork. Dewey thought that it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. As he stood there, he had a brief, startling, clear picture of himself on the raft under the long green shadow of the trees down the river. He saw his hands, broad and strong, gripping the oar and thrusting it into the shallow water, sending the raft over the water like a wind-blown leaf. Smiling, he glanced over his shoulder again, and then he stepped onto the raft. It was made of 9 logs lashed together with strips of hide and was approximately 6 feet across and 8 feet long. Atop the logs, Dewey had laid a floor of smaller split logs, nailing them so that they formed a platform. He had earned the money for the nails by picking up bones on the prairie and selling them in town. He had done all the work himself, and he felt a pride that he had never known before. It was the only thing he had ever made that was for himself alone. His family was almost machine-like in the way they worked to keep alive and comfortable, and sometimes Dewey felt that every hour of his day was taken up with the land and the animals, and that he was part of the farm in the same way the plow was or the wagon. The raft was a separate thing, built only to give pleasure. It seemed to him as fine as any of the rafts he had seen on the big rivers. 5 years before, while waiting to cross the Mississippi, he had counted a string of 120 rafts on its long journey to New Orleans. He had seen the low dog houses for the crew to sleep in, and the raft as big as a field with a tent for the family and fences for the horses and pigs. His was just as sturdy, just as ready to withstand the twists of the current as those. He knelt at the front of the raft, where he had put a large split log with a smooth side to the front. He took some stain he had made from old walnut hulls and dipped his finger into it, and began to print across the front of the log. Slowly, carefully, ignoring the stain that was running down his finger, he began to print the first letter, T. He leaned back and looked at it, not displeased, dipped his finger into the stain again. A wolf howled in the night, and Dewey glanced up. The howl was far away, and after a moment he resumed his work. Once he had seen the wolves from the doorway of the cabin. They had sat in a half circle in the deep grass and howled in the moonlight, and then one wolf, the leader, had turned toward the cabin. His eyes flashed green in the moonlight. Sometimes Dewey saw their tracks in the river in the creek bottoms, but tonight they were far away, chasing elk and deer. His hair, bleached pale from the sun, fell unnoticed over his eyes, and in the moonlight his tanned face was darker than his hair. The tip of his tongue touched the upper lip as he worked. Then he straightened and looked at the words he had printed, the Rosy Bee. The letters were even, and again he felt a surge of pride. The Rosy Bee is a good ship, he thought as he looked her over, and now she was ready for her first voyage. There was a noose of rope thrown over a stump on the bank to hold the raft to shore, and he slipped this off and coiled the rope at his feet. With mounting excitement, his fear forgotten, he bent and picked up the oar laying across the raft. This was his treasure. He had found it on the bank of the big river a year ago when he and his pa had gone to get some wild plum trees. "Pa, look, I found me an oar," he had cried. His pa had looked up, nodded, and then gone back to working with the shovel around the young plum tree. "Can I take it home?" Dewey had stood clutching the oar in his dirty hands, thinking of other people who might have held it. A dark Spaniard, a French hunter, an Indian. "It's a sturdy oar, Pa. Keep it." "Yahoo!" he had cried. Putting his weight to the oar, he had swung it a few feet off the ground before he told his pa what he thought the first moment he had seen the oar in the grass. "Pa, one day I'm going to make me a boat." His pa nodded. "I'll make me a real boat and I'll go everywhere." And now he had his boat. Taking the oar, he jammed it against the muddy bank and pushed it with all his might. He leaned on the oar, and slowly, heavily, the raft moved into the water. It stuck on the muddy bottom, and Dewey pushed again. He could feel his head pounding with the effort. Then there was a certain lightness and ease in the movement. He was afloat. For the first time, he was afloat. He prepared to sweep the oar through the water. He had practiced many times on shore, and he anticipated the powerful surge of the raft. And then, abruptly, he froze. His hands clutched the oar to his chest. He did not move at all. He did not even breathe. For ahead of him, just up the river, he had heard the snort of a pony. His father had taken both horses to Hunter City to pull the wagon, and there were no horses here now. A pony, he thought. An Indian. He waited. He made no noise. The raft slipped back against the bank and stopped. Still, Dewey did not move. The dog at his side sensed his caution, and he too was absolutely still. His ears, which usually flapped over his eyes like eyed shades, were now drawn back. Carefully, silently, Dewey straightened. He looked toward the cabin. His eyes searched the clearing, the grass beyond. Nothing. Still his mind repeated over and over again, a pony, an Indian. He waited. Then, suddenly, he saw a movement in the grass to the left of the cabin. It could have been the wind, he thought, and then he saw in the moonlight the unmistakable gleam of a naked back. A fear clutched him, so great that he felt as if he were spinning around and falling. He was surprised to find a moment later that he was standing on the raft, gripping the splintery logs with his toes. The Indian, unaware that he was being observed, moved in a crouch around the cabin. His oily skin shone in the bright moonlight, and Dewey could see the tuft of hair on top of his head, bound with a cord, with animal furs that hung from a leather thong around his waist, the hatchet, which is an axe, a knife stuck behind the leather thong, and a bow and the shaft of arrows on his back. Suddenly, Dewey thought of his grandma. Again, he heard his father's voice bidding him to take care of her. He heard his own confident words. "I'll look after Grandma, same as you do, Pa." Slowly, he put one foot onto the bank and balanced. Then he casually slipped the raft's rope over the stump. Without a sound, he lowered himself and slithered up until he could see the cabin. The Indian was now approaching the barn. He disappeared into the shadows for a moment, and then Dewey saw the moonlight on his back as he opened the barn door. Dewey heard the sound of the sagging door scraping against the ground. For a moment, he felt easier. The Indian had come to steal the horses, and the horses were safe in Hunter City with his parents. He waited. A mosquito whined in his ear, and Dewey brushed at his face. The Indian looked into the barn and then moved across the yard with the silent ease of an animal. Dewey watched him approaching the cabin, and his moment of relief was gone as quickly as it had come. If the Indian was only after the horses, Dewey thought, he would leave now, move up the river to where his own pony waited. Instead, he was walking toward the door of the cabin. Dewey stepped to the top of the bank, and then he began to crawl up the path, the oar tight against his side. The dog followed beside him. Charlie had smelled the Indian now, and a low growl began deep in his throat. Dewey paused, bent, and reaching backward, grasped the dog by the muzzle and squeezed to quiet to him. The familiar feel of the dog comforted him, and with a deep breath he continued up the path. In the dry grass at the back of the cabin, Dewey crouched. He held the dog to him with one arm. He looked around the side of the cabin. The Indian was not in sight. Still in a crouch, Dewey moved closer. There was something about the Indian's actions that troubled Dewey. The way he moved about the clearing as if everything was familiar. The way he had glanced into the barn without entering. It was almost as if the Indian had known there would be no horses there, Dewey thought. And if he knew that, then he also knew there was no one in the cabin but him and his grandma. Now, suddenly Dewey thought of the cabin door. He had left it unlocked, and just on the other side, sleeping fitfully in her rocking chair, was his grandma. Perhaps at this moment she was dreaming of Indians. Perhaps at this moment the Indian's hand was opening the door. Forgetting his own safety, he started running toward the front of the cabin. Charlie let out a piercing bark and raced around the cabin too. The boy and the dog saw the Indian at the same time. Standing at the cabin door, hatchet in hand. Without hesitating, the dog threw himself up on the Indian. His weight and the suddenness of the spring threw the Indian back against the cabin door. The dog's powerful jaws grabbed the Indian's arm, and he hung there a second, his teeth sinking into flesh. His body swung in the air. Almost at once, the Indian dashed him to the ground, but he went for the Indian's feet, snapping wildly at the flesh just above the leather moccasin. His teeth pierced the Indian's ankle and held until he struck at him with a hatchet. The boy was helping now, hitting him with his oar and screaming, "Pa, Pa, help, Pa!" forgetting that his father was far away in Hunter City. The door of the cabin swung open, and the Indian waited to see no more. He ran with deer-like speed toward the trees. With one leap, Dewey was in the cabin. He thrust his grandma aside and grabbed the gun from the pegs over the door. He was trembling so violently that it took him 2 tries to cock the gun. But when he got to the door, the Indian was far away, riding his pony up the riverbank and out of sight. Charlie had followed the Indian, but half-heartedly. The blow from the hatchet had severed the muscle of the right front leg, and it was now bleeding and useless. Panting, he limped back to the cabin and lay in the dust. Holding the gun against his shoulder, Dewey looked over the horizon for some sign of the Indian, and it was then that he noticed the faint red glow in the north. It could only be a fire, and Dewey thought of the Wicks cabin, which was in that direction. The gun was suddenly heavy in his hands, and he lowered it slowly, and then looked at the glow on the horizon. The dread that rose in him was so great that his knees began to tremble, and he clutched the door for support.